Basic Brewing Radio is sponsored in part by the American Homebrewers Association. Get ready. Saturday, May 7th is the American Homebrewers Association's 25th Big Brew for National Homebrew Day. Visit homebrewersassociation.org/basicbrewing to download the official recipes, the Community American Lager, and Dark Inception Imperial Porter. You can find a homebrew supply shop there, too, and dust off your homebrewing skills with how-to videos. Plus, you'll get a promo code for $5 off an American Homebrewers Association membership when you make the Big Brew Pledge. That's homebrewersassociation.org/basicbrewing to get $5 off when you make the Big Brew Pledge by May 9th, 2022. Welcome to Basic Brewing Radio for Thursday, April 28th, 2022. I'm James Spencer. Here at Basic Brewing Radio, we're all about home brewing. This week, Chris Colby, author of the Homebrew Recipe Bible, Methods of Modern Homebrewing, and How to Make Hard Seltzer, weighs in on adjuncts as a part of our continuing series on recipe development. Reinheitsgeboters, beware! If you go to basicbrewing.com, you can find archives of our audio and video shows. If you go to basicbrewingshop.com, you can find our DVDs and our brewers' logbooks. You can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Basic Brewing and find our show page on Facebook as well. If you want to support us financially, check out patreon.com/basicbrewing. And thanks to everybody who's helping out in that way. If you go to patreon.com/basicbrewing, you can see a long list of stuff that you can access if you sign up as a supporter. Financial supporters have already seen the episode that I'm going to post to the general public this Friday. It's the one about my Christmas Day kettle sour beer that sort of had a difficult birth. My theory is I did too good of a job of souring the wort before pitching the Saccharomyces, and I pitched a lot of Saccharomyces. Luckily, Brettanomyces saved the day and the beer. I got 3 more beers in the works right now. I bottled a small batch dark beer brewed with roasted barley for our tincture sampler series. That's just a 6-pack. Another 6-pack was inspired by Steve Wilkes' challenge to brew a custard pie beer to be flavored with tinctures. And that one came out kind of nothing like I expected. Susan and I also bottled that one. It came out at 9.3% ABV and with a lot more hop flavor than I planned. Luckily, it's a citrus hop flavor, so, that would go along with a lemon tincture if we plan on adding that. Looking forward to hearing what Steve has to say about that one. This afternoon, I'm planning to keg my Bell's Two-Hearted clone that I brewed with Simcoe pellets instead of Centennial. And I dry hop that beer for a couple days with 5 ounces or 142 grams of Simcoe pellets. And, boy, it smells good. And really looking forward to that beer. I also, my second keg is nearly empty, so I have to figure out what to brew next to keep things flowing, literally. It's going to be patio weather here soon. It is right now. Maybe I could brew some sort of a Belgian wit. Speaking of wits and patios, we were at Crisis Brewing in Fayetteville the other evening after seeing Everything Everywhere All at Once. What a ride that movie was. Wow. Highly, highly recommend that one. I didn't know anything about it going into it. Wow. Anyway, a group of folks was sitting in the next booth, and one of the guys at the table said authoritatively, this beer is called a wit. That's W-H-I-T. I didn't say anything. I didn't say anything to anybody, not even people at my table. Maybe I'm growing up. And maybe it's because I only had half a beer at that point. After last week's show with Matt Giovanisi on water chemistry, I finally jumped in and ordered a water test from Ward Labs, and I sent my bottle of water off on Monday, so I should be hearing from them really soon. So getting serious about water. Hey, Mother's Day is coming up, and Ricky and Kelly at Groenfell and Havoc Meaderies in Vermont are thinking about Mom. If you go to groenfell.com, you can find a Mother's Day mead shop, a special page just for Mom. In it, you can find apparel like the Hoppy Mama T-shirt designed by Kelly, CEO Kelly herself, featuring the Hop Bee from the Hop Swarm can, Mother's Day Mead Brunch Kits, featuring an assortment of delicious Groenfell and Havoc meads with 4 bottles of Run-A-Muck maple syrups to choose from. You got your Run-A-Muck maple bourbon barrel-aged maple syrup, cinnamon and vanilla maple syrup, Mackroot lime leaf maple syrup, and Sugar Maker's cut maple syrup. Wow. You can pair those with Hop Swarm, Psychopomp, Old Wayfarer, and or Valkyrie's Choice. Think about that. Think about that for a Mother's Day brunch idea. You'll have a happy mead mama, and you can have them shipped to you across the country. Check out the Mother's Day Mead Shop, along with the other craft honey-based deliciousness at family-owned and operated Groenfell.com. That's Groennfell. Okay, our recipe development theme's journey continues as we dissect the list of ingredients that you'll be choosing from as you build your own beers. This week it's Chris Colby and Adjuncts. Chris Colby, welcome back to Basic Brewing Radio.
Hey, James. Thanks for having me on the show.
We're breaking in a new piece of equipment today. We've got a new board that I'm talking into, and you're talking into as well. So cross your fingers we don't have to do this again. I think I know how to use it.
It's the big board.
Tell, what's your favorite corny joke?
As a general, my favorite corny joke. Oh, God, I don't even know. That would have worked with this installment. With Adjuncts.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah, there we go.
That's all I wanted to do. I swear I won't use it again. Just justifying the cost of the. Well, this is the next episode in our recipe development series, and now we're going into non-Reinheitsgebot territory here, talking about adjuncts.
Yes.
Hello? Is this board working? Hello?
Hello? Is this thing on?
No, but the old German purity law doesn't cover all these extra things that people put in beers, but people like the Belgians, they seem to like the adjuncts quite a bit.
Yeah, I mean, the use of adjuncts in brewing goes way back, and in basically all cultures. I mean, it's part of the reason why the Germans had to, felt they had to make a law about it. But yeah, I mean, certainly Belgians use a lot of adjuncts. British brewing, traditionally used a lot more, and they actually had to step in with some laws to get brewers to stop adding some of the things they were adding. And of course, America has always had used corn and rice with their light lagers, and so yeah, it's and even today in craft brewing, you can't brew a glitter beer without adding glitter to it. Technically, that wouldn't be an adjunct because it's not fermentable, but
Yeah, I guess in the old days, people used to put a lot of stuff that wasn't good into beer, but we're not talking about that. We're talking about things that will improve your beer if you do it right.
Yep.
So I guess, what is an adjunct when we're talking about these good kinds of adjuncts? What are they and what purpose do they serve?
An adjunct is usually defined in brewing as something other than a malted grain that's going to add fermentable carbohydrates to your wort or your beer. They may additionally add other flavors and aromas or colors, and they can impact other characteristics as well, including mouthfeel and haze and lauder ability. An adjunct can have a lot of different potential effects.
Can have a potential effect on the final gravity of the beer as well, one way or the other.
Yeah, it should. I mean, the whole point of adding it is that you boost the amount of fermentable sugars in your wort. So yeah, use of adjunct should boost your original gravity. And
depending on what kind of sugar that you use, you can have a lower final gravity. It can dry out your beer more, or in the case of, say, lactose, for example, milk sugar, it can actually add more body at the end of the process.
Yeah, yeah, you can definitely, straight refined sugar is 100% fermentable, and whereas wort made from barley malt is not 100% fermentable. It's like, does your new board allow you to just insert things later? It's X%. 75% fermentable.
I'll try to do my Chris Colby impression later on and edit in a number. So I'm going by an outline that you generously provided me, and according to the outline, there are two main types of adjuncts. And what are those?
Yeah, well, the point of an adjunct is to add fermentable carbohydrates to your wort, and so there's basically two kinds. There's sugary adjuncts and starchy adjuncts. So the sugary ones add sugar, they are sugar, so they add sugar directly to the wort, and the starchy ones, add starch initially to your mash, but then it's just broken down and add sugar indirectly.
And the sugary ones are easy to use because you can just put them in the boil.
Yeah, all that's required of a sugary adjunct is add it to your wort at some point, just long enough for it to dissolve, and you're good. So, like if you're adding just plain refined sugar, a lot of recipes, tell you to wait for less, 5 minutes, or, you can even do that in the whirlpool or something. But it's generally added in the kettle.
And what percentage of the fermentables should you shoot for generally for sugary adjuncts?
It really just depends on what you're trying to do. Like a Belgian triple, for example, has quite a high amount of sugar added to it. And that's because, they want it to be more alcoholic, so the sugar boosts the original gravity, but also they want it to be reasonably dry, given the strength. And so there's a relatively large amount of adjunct in that, like 30 to 40%. Mm. And, for American Pilsners and stuff, around 30%, and, up to 40 and maybe down to 20, depending on which beer it is. Of the starchy adjuncts, either corn or rice. And so, generally, there aren't really any commonly brewed beers that are like there's more adjunct than malt in it. Although certainly when you get into the malternative beverages, that you can find that. But in what we traditionally think of a beer, they're usually a minority, and in most cases, and this is, there are, what's the word I'm looking for? Exceptions. Jesus Christ. There are exceptions, but generally 40% is a pretty good top level for most of these.
And the sugary ones, like for example, if you're making a big old, double or triple IPA, West Coast IPA, where you don't want it to be syrupy like a barley wine at the end of the process, you can add some just plain old sugar in that beer to thin it out at the end, not only to add the alcohol, but to make it a drier, kind of less sweet tasting beer and more palatable and more suited to the style. Yeah,
and that's in fact exactly what commercial brewers of the stronger IPAs do. They add quite a bit of sucrose, and sometimes up to maybe 20%, and that as you say dries it out a little bit, just so that like when you're tasting the strong hoppy beer, it tastes more like a double IPA than a richer, sweeter barley wine.
So what kinds of you subdivide the sugary adjuncts even further? You have refined and less refined, and what's the difference between the two?
Refined sugars are like table sugar, which is like sucrose, or also glucose, fructose, and lactose are of the simple sugars that are used heavily in brewing, those are those. And there's, of course, glucose and fructose can be lumped together as monosaccharides because there's like each molecule of sugar has essentially one molecule of sugar, which sounds circular, but that's opposed to disaccharides like sucrose and lactose that have two, sugar residues, but they're bonded together, and then the one sugar molecule can be broken down into two, single units. So yeah, the refined sugars are just the sugars where they've taken whatever source they're getting the sugar from, extracted everything, all the other things that go along with it, and just leave the pure sugar itself. Like sucrose or glucose in the dried state is a white crystal, and that's because all the sugar cane that it came from, all the plant pieces have been removed, and just leaving the pure sugar.
And what makes something like lactose less fermentable? Why can't the yeast eat lactose where they can just plain table sugar?
That's a good question. I don't know exactly. I would guess it probably has to do either with transport of that particular molecule into and out of the cell, or just it's a different shape than sucrose, so maybe the enzymes that normally break down sucrose into glucose and then put that through fermentation just don't work. But that's a good question, and I don't know.
And it's interesting that the lactose is less sweet. So even though it leaves a body to the beer, it's not necessarily, at least on my palate, a sweetness, characteristic. It's not like there's a whole bunch of, say regular table sugar left in the beer. It's more of a perception of a body or a fullness, like with a milk stout. I guess it is sweet, but it's not super sweet to me.
Yeah, it's not intensely sweet. For intensely sweet beers, how they do it commercially, of course, is pasteurization. They'll dose the beer with sugar after it's been brewed, and then pasteurize it. And if you've ever had Mackeson stout, that's like sweet as the day is long, and that's because they dosed it with sugar and pasteurized it. But yeah, lactose adds less sweetness. It's less sweet than sucrose or glucose or fructose, and additionally, it's not fermentable. So you have to add, if you wanted like sweetness to be a definite characteristic in your beer, you need to add quite a lot of it. But you could, because it's not really going to stress the yeast out because they're just not using it.
And you've got a whole list of less refined or less processed sugars, or are they more processed?
Well, some of them, most of these are less refined, but there's also sugars that start with refined sugars and then process them some more, and then they don't become less refined, but they just become not, refined sugars anymore. Yeah, there's a whole bunch of sugars that can be used in, or are commonly used in brewing beer. Corn syrup, commercial brewers, especially of American light lagers, use corn syrup. High fructose corn syrup can be used too, although in brewing there's really no need for that because it's all going to be fermented away. Rice syrup is also a thing, and rice syrup solids can be added to beers. Honey is used in commercial brewing a lot, and also very popular among homebrewers. And then you get to like molasses and the brown sugars. Okay, so molasses is a very sweet syrup, and there's also treacle and golden syrups that are essentially the same thing. And then these can be dried into brown sugars, and brown sugar is usually sometimes it's refined sugar with molasses added to it, and sometimes it's just less refined sugar. You sort of have to read the package to know which that is. And there's a whole bunch of different brown sugars, including Demerara or Picancillo, or every culture has a sort of brown sugar of their own, and sometimes these are spiced with additional things. So there's a wide variety of brown sugars you can use. There's invert sugar, which is sucrose, okay, which is the disaccharide, and it's heated in the presence of acid. Okay, this results in it breaks the bond between the glucose and the fructose residue in the sucrose, and it results in sort of an intensely sweet kind of sugar. And Belgian candy sugars. There was a time in homebrewing, like in the late '80s and '90s, when people were like, oh, you got to use Belgian candy sugars if you're brewing a Belgian beer, because in their mind that Belgians would never use just sucrose. Whereas if you go to an actual Belgian brewery, they got stacks and stacks of it. So, but anyway, Belgian candy sugars they start. There's a couple different ways they can be made, but one of it is they start with relatively unrefined sugars, and they heat it, which results in some caramelization, but also some of the unrefined elements will contribute Maillard reactions. So, it'll make a brown colored candy sugar that's also very flavorful.
Yeah, and with the different color temperatures of the Belgian candy sugars especially, you can add a lot of color to your beer as well as flavor, and drying out the beer a bit. And there's some residual sweetness there as well. So there's lots of fun ways you can play with sugars. The brown sugars, and I've used even pancake syrup and maple syrup and anything that will is sugary and will ferment, or maybe not, can be used in a beer, and come out with something tasty.
Sure, and I mean the possibilities are endless. There's caramel, there's agave syrup, maple syrup. I've used Mountain Dew before in a beer. I had actually used Mountain Dew as the mash water, and it worked. It was actually pretty good. So yeah, there's any sugary thing you can add to beer. And the nice thing about using sort of just plain sugar substances as a kettle adjunct is like we said before, all you need to do is just heat them long enough to get them dissolved into solution, and you're done. So it's the either refined sugars or syrups or brown sugars or any of the sugars that result from heating refined sugars. Yeah, they're all going to have a specific taste they add. They're all going to add generally quite a bit of gravity points to your beer. Straight sugars, gonna up your specific gravity very quickly. And yeah, they can be great in a beer, or they can be disastrous.
Yeah, what happens if you use too much? What's the threshold, and what happens when you go overboard?
On refined sugars, if you use too much, you're eventually going to run into fermentation problems. Although you could counter that by adding yeast nutrients. There's also something that homebrewers call like rocket fuel. Like you've added so much refined sugar that you've boosted the alcohol quite a bit, but it just it gets very like harsh tasting. Mm-hmm. And they used to say that there was a cidery flavor to adding sugar, but that's actually turns out mostly not true. But yeah, too much sugar is just and you have to have quite a bit. And then and of course if you know enough about yeast nutrients to bump that up, you can get away with adding quite a bit. But if you add way too much, you just end up with something that's very, very alcoholic, and sometimes unpleasantly so.
Yeah, many years ago, Don Osborne sent in a dandelion wine that he made, and it was basically just sugar water with dandelions added, and it was delicious. It was kind of champagne-y. It wasn't the kind of, it wasn't hot, so he took care of the yeast. It wasn't cidery, as I would have expected. It was just a nice, dry, champagne-y beverage with really interesting and fun, dandelion component to it. So yeah, if you take care of your yeast, if you make sure that there's enough nutrients in there, if you know how to do fermentation right, adding a lot of sugars is not going to, turn out to be disastrous.
Right. Like nobody may know about this, but there are these beverages called hard seltzers. Yeah, I'd never heard of them either. But apparently, yeah, they're made just from fermenting sugar, and that's it. And if you take care of, it gets trickier. And I don't know, maybe someone's written a book on the subject. But, if you get the yeast nutrients correct, you can ferment pure sugar and it's fine. So,
reference the book "How to Make Hard Seltzer" by Dr. Chris Colby.
Yes.
It does get tricky though, as in my experience, you really do have to take care of your yeast.
It's a little like mead. Mead is not quite only sugar, but it's pretty close to it. Honey is doesn't have a lot of components other than the actual sugars. So yeah, making mead and making hard seltzer have a lot of things in common.
Yeah, although I've found that mead is a lot more forgiving than the hard seltzer. I've never had a mead just, crap out on me and refuse to do anything. Knock wood. I have had a rocket fuel mead or two, but that was a long time ago. Let's talk for a minute about our friends and sponsors at Imperial Organic Yeast. I had a great brew day the other day, brewing with my Simcoe Two-Hearted clone out on the patio. My original gravity wound up at 1066, which is it's a little better than the previous time that I brewed it, at least a similar recipe. I pitched a pouch of A07 Flagship from Imperial, which is the trusty Chico strain, and I'm not kidding when I say if I pitch in the early afternoon, my airlock is usually bubbling before bedtime, and it was. And the next morning, the wort was swirling around with the airlock chugging away, which I find mesmerizing. And at some point in the proceedings, the airlock stopped chugging because it had foam in it. Luckily, I caught it and added some firm cap ash to calm things down a bit. But the point is, with Imperial Organic Yeast, I can trust that those 200 billion cells in each easy-to-open package will get to work in short order. My stir plate is dusty because I don't use it anymore for moderate gravity 5-gallon batches. You got to love it. Ask your local homebrew store about Imperial Organic Yeast and check them out at imperialyeast.com. That's imperialyeast.com. There are fruits. There are all kinds of different fruits, and we may want to expand that conversation about fruits a bit later. But, fruits can be added right into the fermenter as well.
Yeah. Fruits you can really add anywhere. You can add them in the mash, but there's sort of no real reason to do that. A lot of old school homebrew recipes used to call for boiling the fruit with the idea that it needed to be sanitized and not contaminate the beer. But by sort of, by following what commercial brewers have been doing, and B, just trying things out, they pretty much found that you can add it in the secondary, what we'd call secondary fermentation, and it works fine. And given that you don't heat the fruit, you don't change this flavor or blow off, its volatiles. It retains more of the aromatics. But yeah, a lot of fruits are high enough in sugar that adding a reasonable amount will boost your fermentable carbohydrates, and then of course they'll add their characteristic flavor. Like raspberries are great in homebrew. There's a lot of like back in the day, raspberry Hefeweizen used to be a thing that people loved to brew, and it's actually made pretty good beer. Also, cherry wheat beers. People used to make cherry beers on cherry, like cherry porter or cherry stout. Basically any of the sugary fruits that people ate, people turned into some sort of beer. And yeah, if you add like one thing that homebrewers have kind of settled on and works pretty well is adding fruit purees in secondary.
Mm-hmm.
It sort of saves you the hassle of having to go clean and pit all your fruit and then do any sort of processing, because you just open a can and dump it in, and you can get some pretty decent. They're good suppliers of fruit, that the purees of decent quality.
Yeah, the Oregon Fruit Company sent me some big old cans of fruit puree, which I used in beers, fermented and unfermented. I put some of them in the keg, and just kept the temperature cold, so that the fermentation didn't kick back up again. And so that way you can add fruit to your beer, maintain all of the fruity characteristics of that fruit, and you could also stabilize your beer beforehand with in the same way that you would stabilize a yeast or a mead, and then add the fruit there. Now, of course, you couldn't bottle condition after that because the yeast would be asleep and not be able to carbonate the beer. But those are ways that you can add fruit to your beer and then keep that fruity characteristic.
Yeah, if you stop the fermentation, then the fruit will also have, normally when you taste the flavor of fruit, you're also tasting a lot of sweetness along with it. And in some beers, if you use the fruit and all the sugar ferments away, the flavor is like, it seems a little different than you're used to. So yeah, that can be arresting a fermentation, or just adding it in the keg and keeping it cold, which would arrest the fermentation. Yeah, it can be a good way to make a fruity beer with a little bit of sweetness to it.
In these days of puree, milkshake beers and all the super fruity beers, I guess the guidelines are pretty much completely up to the brewer. But in your mind, when you make fruit beers, what's the target? When you are formulating a recipe, what's the amount of fruit in the fermentables that you shoot for?
Yeah, it sort of depends on like how intensely fruity you want it, and the intensity of the fruit itself. Like raspberries, one nice thing about raspberries is they're fairly intensely flavorful, so you can add a fairly small amount and get a nice beer. Like if you add like 5% raspberries or a 5% mixture of like raspberries and blackberries to like a wheat beer, it's going to have the taste of the fruit. It's not going to be like overpowering, but it's going to be nice, and you'll get the flavor of the fruit, and you haven't used like a ton. For something like cherries, which are like not as intensely flavorful, like I've made a lot of or relatively a lot of sort of dark beers with cherry in it, and for me about between 10 and 15%, using the wet weight of the fruit compared to the grain bill, gives enough of the cherry flavor to be good, noticeable, not knocking you on your head. But yeah, it really depends on the flavor. Like some people try to brew with apricots or peaches. Peaches especially aren't really, the intensity of flavor is pretty low. I mean, the flavor itself is good. And so if you want to use something like peaches, you're going to have to add quite a bit, especially if you want a strong peach flavor. And then a lot of people, of course, if they're making a peach beer, also add some apricots in there because they're like a stronger tasting version of that. And yeah, you can, these days giving recommendations on how much fruit to add to, somebody somewhere is going to have, that's way out of that ball. Some people probably, 90% something, and release it as a beer.
And we have to say what we're talking about. Is it peaches or apricots or both, where you don't want to put the pits in the beer?
I think you could go ahead on either one of those. I mean, they both, any of the stone fruits have they've all got cyanide in their pits, but like the amount of, unless you made a beer that out of ground up peach pits and that's it, it's just the dosage is never going to be high enough to really worry about it. There might be, I mean, like apricot pits or peach pits are big enough that you might end up extracting some tannins or something from them. There's enough of a weight there that maybe you'd want to do it. Also, I mean, removing peach pits is easy because they're huge. You can do that quickly. But yeah, there used to be the idea that adding, the pits of any stone fruit would result in poisoning, and it's the poison is there, but it's in such tiny amounts that it's not worth bothering with.
Legal disclaimer: don't put pits in your beer. We'll have some prisoners out there listening to this, and they'll make a beer. Somehow they'll make some Pruno out of peach pits or something, and start poisoning themselves, and they'll sue us. Don't do it. Don't make Pruno with peach pits. Now we've talked about the easily added and the easily fermented adjuncts, but now let's talk about the starchy adjuncts, and you've got to take care of those in the mash before they're available.
Yeah, when you add a starchy adjunct, what you want is the sugars from the starch, and so you've got to break down that starch, and that means you need to add it to the mash. And you've got to make sure that your malt has enough diastatic power to convert all that. Because if not, if your starch goes into your beer, not only is it unfermentable, but it causes haze, and then it's sort of later it'll break down into sugars, and any contaminants in the beer will start growing. So for example, on sort of brewing American Pilsners or those sort of beers, 30 to 40% of the weight, and there's examples outside of that range. It's generally the corn or the rice, and then the remaining is, these days usually a blend of 2-row and then 6-row. But you need to have enough diastatic power, and that generally means you need to use United States malts that are going to have the DP rating from 120 to 160. Generally for 2-row around 120, 6-row gets up to about 160. And you'll need that if you're going to have 30 to 40% of your sugars coming from the starches in these adjuncts.
Why would you want to put that much corn and rice in your beer?
Well, the original reason was that when European brewers came over to the United States, at first, the type of barley grown in the United States was mostly 6-row, and this is a higher protein barley than the 2-row. And so brewing was straight with the barleys that existed then, would result in a hazy beer. But corn and rice, corn and rice are both cereal grains, just like barley is, but they have a much lower protein content. So you mix the two, and you get the protein down to the point where you can make clear beer. And it's also, it was just something that people liked. It was, it made a lighter, I don't know what you say, more quaffable or something, made it more easy drinking, which is, that phrase sounds ridiculous. But, it consumer demand also. And additionally, at least, the price of the commodities varies over time, but a lot of times corn and rice were less expensive than malted barley. It's not always true, but so it's a variety of things.
Now you have listed here flaked and roasted barley. It's barley. Does it still count as an adjunct?
Yeah, because it's not malted. So yeah, flaked barley is one of the one of the adjuncts that brewers use. It's a lot of times, most people, well, so homebrewers have seen it as a component of like a Guinness type dry stout. And an interesting thing about flaked barley is you can just stir that right into your mash and be done with it. But for some adjuncts like corn and rice, stirring it into the mash itself isn't going to do what you want, because the gelatinization temperature of the starches is higher than the mash temperature. So for example, in corn and grits, they need to be put, in commercial breweries, they have a cereal cooker where they put the corn or the rice and, generally a little bit of barley, crushed barley malt, and they cook it until, the starches all, gelatinize, and then they dump that into the main mash, which, they've originally mashed in at a low temperature. And when they dump in the boiling cereal mash, it comes up to the mash temperature they want. And the combination of that leads to making a beer with a very fermentable wort.
Now, when you get to, say, flaked maize or flaked barley, my understanding is that they are pre-gelatinized by the heat in the rolling process. Is that true? So you don't need to make a cereal mash out of a flaked maize product.
Right. If you use flaked maize or any flaked product, how they're made is they wet the grains and then they send them through just a set of rollers that just squashes them flat and also heats them, that dries them. But additionally, any starches in that are broken down into their component sugar. So like flake maize is something that homebrewers use a lot. It's not really used that intensely in commercial brewing. But yeah, it's if you want to brew an American style beer and don't want to go through the hassle of doing, a cereal cook, flaked maize, works great. Just dump it in and it adds sugars, it adds, very little flavor, very little color. And same goes with flaked barley, and there's flaked oats, there's flaked rye, there's flaked wheat.
And there's torrefied wheat too, which is like a puffed product. Heated
and puffed, and so there's a sort of, I don't know, it's been described as like a biscuit-like flavor that comes with it that's a little different from like either flaked wheat or malted wheat.
Let's talk about our friends and sponsors, Desiree and Dave at HighGravityBrew.com. In a couple of weeks, we're going to go see them in Tulsa because we're going to see Elvis Costello and Nick Lowe at Kane's Ballroom. I'm so pumped about that. And if we don't get an encore of them both singing Peace, Love, and Understanding, I'll eat my hat. Note to self, bring an edible hat. Anyway, I'm also looking forward to sampling beers beforehand at Pippin's Tap Room at High Gravity. They've always got something innovative and delicious on tap. How does that relate to you across the country? Well, a lot of the award-winning beers from Pippin's wind up as ingredient kits on HighGravityBrew.com. So you can brew those recipes, those crowd-tested recipes yourself. Looking on HighGravityBrew.com right now, I see Stumbling Dragonfly IPA, This Aggression Will Not Stand Man, which is a really tasty pale milk stout. Sort of a delicious brewing magic trick, in my opinion. And Roughneck Black Lager. Desiree and Dave opened their shop around the time that I started this podcast, maybe a little before, and that's a long time ago. And the kits on HighGravityBrew.com have kept up with the times, always extending the envelope of deliciousness. Check them all out as well. I swear I hadn't been drinking. Check them all out as well as the Build Your Own Beer page. And, of course, all the excellent Warthog electric brewing systems. That's at family-owned and operated HighGravityBrew.com. That's HighGravityBrew.com. So, yeah, what are the characteristics, with the sugars, the fermentable sugars? We want to dry out our beer. We want to add color. We want to add flavor. Well, what about these starchy adjuncts? What are we shooting for when we're putting those in our recipe?
Basically, it's mostly just the fermentable carbohydrates. I mean, when you use corn in a beer, you can taste a little bit of corn, and some types of American Pilsners, actually play that up. Like there's a beer that used to be available, and then now the brand was revived by Shells, I think, in the Upper Midwest called Grain Belt, and it very definitely tasted of corn. And with a name like Grain Belt, that was like a selling point for them. So yeah, you can taste the corn. You can taste rice in some of those, both Asian lagers or the American ones that use rice. Although, I mean, rice has a very subtle flavor, but there's a little bit of flavor. But mostly they're there just to dilute the protein and just to give up simple sugars in the mash.
And we can't leave our discussion about talking about adjuncts without talking about vegetables as well, like taters and pumpkins. Although, is a pumpkin a vegetable or a fruit?
A pumpkin is a fruit, but I mean, culinary wise, it's a vegetable, and it's starchy as opposed to sugary. So I put it in the vegetable section.
Because somebody's going to call you out on that.
Yeah. Well, hey, if someone wants to go toe-to-toe with me on pumpkins, I'm willing to do that. I've grown giant pumpkins in my garden. I've fermented beer inside giant pumpkins. And
you, sir, are not a pumpkin.
I can tell you virtually everything about the botany of pumpkins. And I understand that they're fruit because they develop from a flower and they have seeds in them. But
I know pumpkins. I've worked with pumpkins, and you, sir, are not a pumpkin.
Not a pumpkin, yeah.
Name that reference.
Lloyd Benson, right?
That's right.
Dan Quayle. Yeah.
But you got to mash the pumpkins and the potatoes and turn those starches into sugars.
Yeah, and interestingly, actually, I can talk about both of these, but we'll start with pumpkins. Pumpkins, you can just cube them, add them to the mash. You don't need to do a cereal cook with them, but they don't add typically a lot of flavor. If you want to enhance the flavor, you can roast them, and you can also use just find a flavorful version of squash and mix it in with your pumpkin, and that'll give you not only the sugars from the pumpkin, but also a little bit of squashy, pumpkin-y flavor. You can also literally ferment a beer inside a pumpkin. And I tried it, and I was worried at the time that it would, because the alcohol is in there, it would make the shell soft, and then it would like burst in the bottom of my chest freezer that's turned into a fermentation fridge. But no, I brewed a beer, fermented to completion. I was lazy and left it for several days before I racked it out of the pumpkin into the keg, and yeah, it's incredible.
Mm. Did it add a vegetal flavor?
Oh, yeah. If I ever do it again, I'm gonna try to roast the inside of the pumpkin shell before I use it, because it just tasted like raw pumpkin. It was otherwise good, but it's just like, yeah, that's raw pumpkin.
So what are you share some stories? What are some of your favorite adjunct beers? Maybe some. I mean, you talked about Mountain Dew. That's a pretty unexpected adjunct. But how adventurous have you gotten with adjuncts?
I've tried a lot of different stuff. I mean, I'm mostly like a beer flavored beer guy, but I also just like trying stuff, and I also think of myself as someone who is a reasonably good cook. So I've tried a lot of different things. One of the best things I probably ever tried adjunct wise was I made what I called a sweet potato ESB. I just took like a sort of a vaguely Fuller's ESB clone and made maybe 20% of the mash from sweet potatoes. And the interesting thing about that is, so I just peeled the potatoes, cubed them, I boiled them before I put them in the mash, although I don't think I really would have needed to. If you just slice them up thin enough, you could do it. But it was easier to boil them. And the interesting thing was that I didn't roast them at all, so they didn't add any flavor at all that I could detect. But they gave the beer like a really nice looking sort of orange color. It was really interesting, and and it basically tasted like a British pale ale clone of some sort, and that was a pretty good beer. And I did pumpkin beer. I mean, it was a pumpkin old ale that I fermented inside the pumpkin. And I've done the Mountain Dew beer, where I added it's basically a mixture about like 3/4 Mountain Dew and 1/4 water, and that was my mash water. And some mash ran it off, and that adds Mountain Dew. The color is like green or yellow or something, but the flavor is orange. And anyway, I remember back at the time I used to read quite a few of the online, brewing discussion groups, and I mentioned I was doing this, and people just fell out of the woodwork to tell me how that wouldn't work. That Mountain Dew has preservatives in it. You're going to kill all the yeast, and you don't know what you're doing. Which of course gave me the opportunity to be Mr. Smarty Pants and say, actually, Mountain Dew has enough sodium benzoate to keep the amount of contaminants expected in Mountain Dew from growing, but they don't have enough to overcome like an entire yeast pitch, And so, I just made sure to have a nice healthy yeast starter and pitched it, and it was absolutely fine. And it was weird in that, like, one of my later beers, because I tried it a couple different times, I made sort of a Belgian-y, Belgian-y one with the, a little bit of, orange flavor, which I left that up to the Mountain Dew to supply, and then a little bit of coriander. And that turned out pretty well. And it was the kind of thing, like, if you didn't tell somebody it was like a soda pop beer, they never would have known it, because the color wasn't that far different from, because Mountain Dew is sort of yellow-ish anyway, so the color wasn't impacted that much, and there was enough wheat in the recipe too that there was a slight haze to it, and so that was a pretty interesting adjunct beer. And then, God, I've done Jolly Rancher lambics, to making a sour beer and adding like the literal green apple Jolly Ranchers to it. Endless amount of beers with honey, molasses. I used to always brew my porter with some molasses in it. I still do every once in a while. But I just found that it doesn't, I don't know, the amount of that, I was adding just a little bit of molasses, and the amount wasn't like, it was at the point where I was just like, either boost it so that it tastes more like molasses or cut it. And most of the times now, I just don't do that. But I've brewed a lot of molasses beers, and of course I've heard of all sorts of people, all sorts of homebrew brewers doing weird stuff, like like in Vermont or whatever, they would get the, not maple syrup, but the liquid that gets boiled down into maple syrup, and then to use that to brew their beer with, and it would come out, sort of subtly mapley. We've done that, or at least I attended a brewing session with our friends Casey and Jen, where they used maple sap as the brewing water, and I think it was like the specific gravity of the maple sap was only like 1.009 or something like that. There's very little sugar in the maple sap. That's why I have to boil it down so much. But we added some grade B maple syrup to the beer as well. It was actually a really delicious beer. Steve Wilkes and I have brewed a beer where all of the brewing water was watermelon juice. Oh, nice.
And but the final product did not come out to be reddish or taste like watermelon. So, and of course we've used breakfast cereals, all your Count Choculas and your.
I remember that one.
Yeah, I've got a recipe in your Homebrewer's recipe Bible. With the
Frankenberry wheat.
Yeah, Frankenberry wheat. That's right. So, yeah, there's all kinds of fun that you can have with adjuncts. You don't have to be afraid of the Reinheitsgebot police coming and especially nowadays with everybody trying everything. And if you use adjuncts judiciously, they can improve your beer and not just for crazy reasons.
Yeah, that makes a good point. Like one thing, like I really haven't done a deep dive into all the just weird ass, crazy ingredient beers these days. But one thing, I don't know, like I see a lot of ideas for these beers, and they've always got all these multiple different ingredients in it that are weird. And a lot of times I think, if you would whittle that down to one or maybe two, if those ingredients worked really well together, you'd be better off than just, sort of the kitchen sink, approach that I see on some. And I don't know, maybe these are all delicious, but, I go to homebrew meetings and I have to say, no, they aren't. Because people bring commercial beers and hey, try this. So I would say, like, if you're going to use adjuncts, I mean, there's of course the classic beer styles that have always, triples have always contained sucrose, American pilsners and cream ales and stuff have always used corn and rice. There's all the Belgian beers that use flaked barley or even roasted barley that's used in a stout is technically, because the barley's not malted, it's technically an adjunct, although most people don't think of it that way. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I would just say know what you're expecting from the adjunct. Know or find out how it interacts with your brewing process to maybe cause things. And if you the problem with just throwing a bunch of different types of things in is you don't know how they're all going to interact with each other. And so once again, I'm like old man shouts at cloud. I don't like these newfangled beers.
Well, all right. I'm gonna hit the stop button now and see if this worked. If not, we'll be talking again real soon.
Nice.
And then I'll have an excuse to use this.
Is there a toilet flush on there?
No, not yet.
Not yet.
I can put my own sounds on there. I swear I'm not going to use this. I won't abuse this until Steve's coming on. Then I gotta use the rim shot. So, all right, Chris. I appreciate it once again.
Yeah, it was fun talking to you.
Well, thanks again to Chris. I think Chris and I are going to talk about yeast next. Another big topic that Chris should help simplify and explain, perhaps inspire. If you have brewing questions, show suggestions, or just want to say howdy, write to James at basicbrewing.com or just fill out the contact form at basicbrewing.com. And please don't forget to tell us where you're from. Check out our mobile-friendly shop at basicbrewingshop.com. Thanks to everybody supporting us through our Patreon page. Special goodies coming your way. Check that out at patreon.com/basicbrewing. That's all until next time. Until then, thanks for listening, everybody. I'm James Spencer. Production help for Basic Brewing Radio and our website is provided by Kelly Dotson. Basic Brewing Radio is a production of Active Voicing. We'll talk to you next time, everybody. In the meantime, stay well and stay tuned. So long.